I'm Greg Holbrook. Thank you for joining us. We're here today at the museum's Sheldon Research Library. This is where we house our extensive collection of newspapers, which spans most of the 1900s. Avid readers of the New Smyrna Beach Observer may recall the name Lois Tipton. Back in 1996, Miss Tipton began writing a column that focused on local history in the early 20th century. Her Old Days, Old Ways column was a down-home nostalgic look back at everyday life in small-town New Smyrna. Miss Tipton recently sat down to talk about her life and career with another individual you may recognize from our museum family. Dr. Frank Farmer is the host of our popular Veterans History Project. So sit back and get ready for some lively conversation with one of New Smyrna's most entertaining senior citizens. Here's Dr. Farmer and our special guest, Lois Tipton.
Mrs. Tipton is a native Floridian, having been born in New Smyrna Beach 98 years ago. As a matter of fact, she's more than a native Floridian. She's a fifth generation native Floridian. She grew up here in New Smyrna Beach, and today we're going to talk to her about how life was in New Smyrna Beach in the 1930s and 1940s and what it was like during those days. Mrs. Tipton has written a wonderful book entitled Early Days, Old Days, and Old Ways, and a copy of this is in the New Smyrna Museum of History. So, Mrs. Tipton, thank you very much for taking the time to come here today and to be with us.
You're welcome. I'm very, very happy to be here. However, it was two books I wrote.
Oh, what was
the first book was about stories that I remember, things that happened in New Smyrna. The second book has recipes in it. I put a recipe in there for a soup that Native Americans know, Native Floridians know, many people don't know, but they're on the beach every so often. A lot of little tiny shells come up. They're called periwinkles. And they're little tiny things, all colors and everything. And they have a little piece of meat of some kind inside of them, a little animal or whatever. And you boil it, and you put a little butter and maybe salt and pepper, whatever it is to your taste. And it's the most delicious broth you've ever put in your mouth.
Now that's periwinkle soup.
Periwinkle soup.
And this is in your other book that I didn't mention, that's a recipe book.
Right.
Is that copy also at the New Smyrna Museum of History?
Oh, yeah. I hope it is.
Okay, well.
There are two books. The first book has just loads of stories of things I remember, actual things that happened. The second book has recipes in it.
Well, we're going to talk about the book, and I'd love to see the recipe book. So if it's not in the New Smyrna Museum of History, we'll see if we can.
Oh, I'll get you some.
Get it in there, okay?
It has the recipe for guava jelly in it. If you know what guava jelly is, if you haven't lived, if you have had guava jelly, I grew up with it. I had it on my lunch every day. That's all my mother had. I grew up during the Depression.
Well, I know that guava jelly, I think, is for sale at the New Smyrna Museum of History, so it is still around, and the people that live here can enjoy it. Now, let me go back to your family history, because you said you're a fifth generation Floridian. Tell us how your family got here to Florida, and more specifically, how it got to New Smyrna Beach.
I don't know how they got. Actually, to be honest and tell you why they came to Florida, where they ended up, of course. My father was from Tennessee, and he met my mother in Jacksonville. She was a young woman back then, did not have the openings to work like they do now, because my mother's father was a fisherman in the Oak Hill, Titusville area, and he drowned, which left the family without support. So my grandmother's two older brothers, Benny and Reddy, came and took care of her. And she had a boarding house in Titusville for years and years. And all of the railroad men that were deadheaded, you know what that means, deadheaded?
No, I don't know what that is.
Well, deadheaded means that you have a layover. Okay, that's the slang for the Florida East Coast Railway. Anybody on the railroad will tell you what a deadhead, okay? Anyway, if you came in from Jacksonville, chances are you wouldn't go right straight back. So you deadheaded in Titusville. And my grandmother had this boarding house where the railroad men stayed because she was a beautiful cook. And I can remember her making biscuits for us, little round biscuits about like that. And they were the best. You could just put one in your mouth and you thought you'd gone to heaven.
So that was your grandmother
My grandmother.
in Titusville that ran a boarding house for mainly for the Florida East Coast.
Mostly for the
people.
railroad men, yes.
And we're going to talk about the Florida East Coast Railroad because the Florida East Coast Railroad is a very important part of the history of New Smyrna Beach, Florida.
Indeed.
But before we get to that, so you were born here in New Smyrna Beach.
Right.
You were born at home, is that correct?
No, I was born, I had a twin sister, identical twin sister. We were born, and my mother did not know she was going to have twins. But I weighed 8 3/4 pounds, and my twin sister weighed 8 1/4 pounds, 17 pounds a baby. And you didn't know you were going to have twins.
Well, I guess
but there were no twins in our family at all.
Really?
So
and
we
now,
were surprised.
Now, back in those days, they didn't have ultrasounds and the equipment we
Nothing.
have now to say,
You
yeah.
just took what you got.
That was. So you were born here, you grew up here, and when you were growing up here, New Smyrna, I assume, was a vastly different place than it was now. The population was much less.
Quieter, more civil. I hate to say that, but it was a place like you could go out and leave your house wide open, but nobody would violate your home.
Now, Canal Street was the main street at that time, like it is now.
Right.
Is that
yes.
correct?
Well, you'll see in the middle of the street there was a strip. Well, I don't know if it's still there. I don't think it is. There was a strip of concrete, and on each side was the red brick. See?
Well, at one time that was a Canal Street named Canal. That was actually a canal that had been built originally, as I understand it, by the Turnbull settlers to help drain the western part of New Smyrna Beach into the Indian River,
Right.
and then it was subsequently covered over.
But it's still there.
The canal is under. It still runs in culverts.
On the north side of the street, under that canal.
All right.
It's still there, goes right straight to the river.
All right.
And that drains, we played in that canal, however, when we were young, because back then the pollutants were out, fertilizers and stuff like that. And the water was crystal clear. It was so pretty.
So when you were growing up, it was still an open canal.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It still is right across the street from my home.
There's a canal that's.
Oh, yeah. You know where the AK Food Market is?
Yes, ma'am.
On the west side, across that road, that's all canal right in there. That's still that canal.
So that's part of the original canal that
Right.
the Turnbull settlers had built
Right.
to drain an area. So as you were growing up, as you said, it was a much quieter area. You said more gentle and more genteel.
More trustworthy,
More
too.
trustworthy. You could leave your house, not lock it, and feel safe.
Next door neighbor would watch it for you.
Now, where did you go to school? What schools did they have at that time?
Well, I went first grade, I was in the Faulkner Elementary.
Was that the only elementary school
Right,
in
the
New
only
Smyrna?
one in New Smyrna.
Okay.
And you went to the 6th grade. And then from there you went to the high school. Junior high, they called it. For
Where was the high school?
where it is right, well, it's on Live Oak Street.
Well, it used to be on Live Oak Street. It's now a public library there.
Okay.
Because they've moved the school since then. If I remember, the school was built, the New Smyrna High School was built in 1926. You were
3 years old.
okay. You were 3. You were born in 1923.
1923.
Is that correct? So you went to Faulkner Street School till the 6th grade, and then you transferred to
Junior high.
to the junior high school. And did you graduate from?
Oh, yes,
From the Live Oak
Oh,
High
yeah.
School?
We were the only twins in the class. There were twins in New Smyrna, but they weren't in the same class. And they made a big deal over it, you know. When we were graduated, you had cap and gown, and we sat up on the stage. The graduating class did. And as they called your name, you got up and walked over, and they gave you your diploma. And I never will forget the man that was, I don't know who it was now, that gave us our diploma. thought he had already given it to me because it was my twin sister that was behind me, and he said, "Oh, well, you've already got one." And she says, "No, no, no." I never will forget that. Long time ago.
Oh my gosh, it was a long time. Do you remember how big your class was, your graduating class?
Oh, I think we had, I don't know, probably 30, 35 students in it.
Now, were most of those students, the boys and girls, were they from families that worked on the Florida East Coast Railroad?
Many, many of them did. Down at, I don't know where the pictures are now, but they have pictures of all the classes. Each class had had a great big framed picture. They had them up on the walls in the school. They are probably in the museum. I don't know.
Okay.
But they should be.
Okay.
Because it's class by class, all the way up.
Now, at that particular time, I assume that a lot of kids that were teenagers did not complete high school. I assume that many of them dropped out in the 10th, 11th grade or 8th grade.
Do you know why? They had to go to work to support the family. Remember, that was the Depression.
So you were a teenager during the Depression. I guess the Depression.
I remember getting up at night or doing it in the morning. I cut a piece of cardboard. We did, other people did it too, to fit in my shoe, so I didn't have to tell my mother I had a hole in my shoe.
Now we're going to talk about the effects of the Depression in this area in a few minutes. The Depression, of course, started in stock market crash was 1929, and then throughout the 30s was the time of the Depressions. But before we talk about the Depression, let's talk about the Florida East Coast Railroad. You've mentioned that the Florida East Coast Railroad was a very important part of the history of New Smyrna Beach. Tell us about that.
Well, there were some shops. There's still, I don't know whether they're still there or not, where they repaired all of the engines or anything wrong with any of the trains.
Well, that was one of the reasons I think that New Smyrna Beach became so important on the Florida East Coast Railroad, because
of the shops.
Of the repair shops.
And many, many, many people in New Smyrna had jobs there. My brother-in-law worked there, and my father never worked there, but he was older, but my brother-in-law worked there for years as a Boilermaker. And he and my sister lived near the shops.
Now, a large part of the population, of the adult population of New Smyrna Beach, worked for the Florida East Coast Railroad, right?
Yes, they were all railroad family.
So this was a railroad town.
Absolutely.
I mean, if I remember, the Henry Flagler, when he built the Florida East Coast Railroad, began building it in the late 1800s and then in the early 1900s, and it had become a very important economic engine to this area. Tell me the members of your family who worked on the Florida East Coast Railroad.
Well, my father worked for him. My uncle Marcus Google worked for him. I worked for him for 5 years.
What was his job with the Florida East?
He was a conductor on the railroad.
What did a conductor do?
A conductor is the man that takes care of the passengers as they get in the train. It sees that they're okay and all that. He stayed usually not off the train. He didn't work off the train. He worked inside the train. And my uncle Marcus worked for him, and my father both worked for him. And I worked for him 5 years.
What was your job on the Florida East Coast Railroad?
Mine?
Yes, ma'am.
I was a secretary. I worked in the superintendent's office. I worked in almost every office on the Florida East Coast Railway.
Now, the offices of the Florida East Coast Railroad here in New Smyrna Beach was located just west of where the railroad tracks run now. I guess in the southwest corner.
That's right.
Is that right?
That's right.
Is that where your office was?
No. Well, my office, I think the building is still there. I'm not sure. It was a brick building that sits out in the middle of the tracks and everything. And there were quite a number of secretaries that worked there. I remember one time we had a superintendent called E.C. McDonald, and he was like a grandfather to all of us. He was one of the nicest gentlemen I've ever known in my life. he called us, whatever our name was, it was Miss Lois and Miss whatever. And we just loved him. He could make us work till midnight. We didn't care. He was that kind of a gentleman. And I remember one time he came in and he said to all of us, he said, there were about, let's see, there was me and my twin sister and Cora Stowe, and there were about 10 secretaries working for the railroad at that time, lots of work. And he came in and he said, I want everybody to get up, go down the stairs, and go down by the tracks. I've got a surprise for you. We couldn't believe what was it, you know. So we did, and the train came in, this passenger train, and as it came in, the last car stopped right where we were. And the girls, all of the other secretaries, we didn't know what it was that he wanted us to see, so they started to run down the tracks alongside the train, and this porter came out of the train, and my twin sister and I were the last ones in the group, and he did like that, and we didn't know what he meant. We stopped, and he went back into the train, last car, and I remember, a passenger car, and he raised the window shade, and there sat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We were stunned, and you know what he did? He looked out and he waved to us and he went.
So he was on his way down to Miami or
Yes.
somewhere south down in there.
Can you believe that? Nobody else saw him but us.
Oh my
The
God.
other girls didn't see him. They pulled the shade back down. That was it.
Now, do you remember the person that was in charge of the Florida East Coast Railroad here in Florida?
P.L. Gaddis.
He was local, Gaddis.
No, he wasn't. Well, he lived here, yes.
Okay, but
he was
the overall
he was the
boss.
superintendent.
All right, and in the state of Florida, there was a man by the name of Ed Ball.
Oh,
You
he
remember?
owned it. See, he owned the railroad.
Okay.
Ed Ball did.
He had bought part of it from
He
Henry
was a
Flagler.
jerk, too. Nobody liked him.
Okay, well,
All the men on the railroad, nobody had any respect
well, I
for him.
remember there was a huge strike that we're going to talk about in a few minutes about the Florida East Coast Railroad. But speaking of where the office was and tell me what some of the other jobs were on the Florida East Coast Railroad. You mentioned a conductor. You mentioned the fact that there were a number
Trainman. There were trainmen.
What does a trainman do?
Well, he goes along on the outside of the train, and there's something on the bottom of the train somewhere. You're a mechanical, I'm not. There was something called a hot box place. It was what they put in the hot box to make the wheels keep turning good. And they had what they call waste, which was a lot of threads and materials and all put together. It was junk, you know. They wiped everything clean, and then they do the oiling or whatever they did to keep the wheels going good. See?
So they had to get under the train to do that, or
No, under the train.
that
they'd
sounds like a dangerous job.
Oh, well, I remember we had a man that lived I live on Canal Street, and as you go down Myrtle Avenue, you turn and you're on Downing Street. And right there, there lived a man and his wife named Skipper. Their names were Skipper. And I remember the day they came to tell her that her husband had climbed up in between the trains to do something that they do, undo the train so the train could go separate. And instead it jammed it and killed him. And I remember plain as day, I'll hear her till the rest of my life. They came to tell her that he was dead.
Well, that sounds like a very dangerous job of trainman. So we talked about the conductors, the good conductors. As a matter of fact, there's a beautiful conductor suit at the New Smyrna Museum of History.
Is there really?
Yeah, with a hat on them.
Yeah.
They were the ones that were the inside of the trains that collected tickets. Now, I think the conductors, at the end of each train back in those days, there was a red train called the caboose.
Oh, yes.
That was where the conductor...
Now, that was on the freight trains.
Okay.
Only the freight trains.
Only the freight train.
Oh, yeah. That was the caboose. The caboose is where the conductor sat while the train was going. and he was always in the caboose.
That was his.
That's where he filled out
office.
all the forms and everything he had to fill out.
So we talked about the conductor. Talked about I said the train man. Is that right? What are some of the other jobs on the Florida East Coast? The engineer, I assume.
Oh yeah. You had the engineer and fireman. The firemen were all black.
And they were the ones that filled the firebox, I assume, with coal.
They were the ones that kept that firebox going. Yeah, the firemen did. Okay. They lived here for years and years and years. They were well known. Everybody liked them. You know, they were good people, hard-working people.
So they were the firemen.
That were the firemen, yes.
And I said the engineers, they're the ones that actually drove the train?
Right. And they didn't know the conductors were in the cars. The engineer drove the train, yes.
Right,
yeah.
All right. So was there a hierarchy, or
or
what was considered to be?
Well, the ones that in the hierarchy were the ones that had been there the longest, and they knew the route, they knew the story, they knew the trade. You know what I mean? Okay. And the newcomers looked up to them because they were very nice people. They were a lot of people who lived right there in New Smyrna. Their children grew up with me. I grew up with them.
So the people that worked on the railroad, they worked on it for years.
Yes, sir. My father did. My father was a conductor, and my uncle was a conductor, but he worked in the freight part of it, and my father worked in the passenger part of it. There's two departments, see.
Now, I assume these were pretty stable jobs at that time, right?
During good paying
during
jobs,
the 30s
too.
and the 40s.
I remember going. My twin sister and I had the great idea of leaving home. You know, every kid wants to leave home for a while. They all do. So we went to Washington. I had an older sister that was already there. She worked at Gallinger Hospital. She was an X-ray technician. And so we decided we were going to take the civil service examination and go to Washington. That was the big thrill.
And work for the government.
Worked for the government during the war, during World War II. So we took the test, and she didn't pass it. I passed it, but she didn't. So my mother got her hat on. You would have had to know my mother. And she said, "I'm sorry, but you are going to pass that test." So she put that hat on, and she went down to the depot restaurant where the offices were, and she said, "Now, I've got two secretaries that could go to Washington. One of them didn't pass the test, and the other one did." And the man said, "Go ahead, let her go." He didn't argue with my mother, May G. So we went up there and stayed a year, lived and worked in the Pentagon building.
Well, we're going to talk about your experience in World War II in a few minutes. But getting back to the Florida East Coast Railroad, at that time it was the whole office complex, the repair shops. There was a bustling group of activities going on there all the time. Do you remember the restaurant that was
Yes,
there?
I do.
Do you remember the name of the restaurant? Were they just call it? I think they just called it Depot Restaurant.
Yeah.
And that was where the passengers could stop, and townspeople. If I remember, it was
everybody ate at the Depot Restaurant. They had good cooks in there, good cooks. The south end of the building was the kitchen type thing. And then they had an opening in there where they had tables, you know, people could eat. They had a counter, lunch counter, that you could either sit at the counter or you could eat at a table. And they did good food. They had the best cooks you ever ate food in your life. People would get off that train and they remember New Smyrna because of that restaurant.
Is that right? So it was
excellent. And
a lot of New Smyrnians went there to eat also. People who lived in New Smyrna also went there.
We ate. Well, the secretaries upstairs would have lunch there every day. We didn't go home. We stayed there and ate.
Oh my gosh, it was.
There were good 10 secretaries upstairs during World War II, working as I can remember myself taking down in shorthand, typing it up, and giving it to the manager, at least 75 letters a day, me, by myself.
That were coming from the railroad or coming from your manager that was going out?
Manager and the operation of the railroad. And there was Cora, Iris, Lois, May, Lolly. There were about 8 secretaries going as hard as we could go all day long. I'd go home at night, and my mother would get mad at us because she'd want us to be up and talking to her and everything. We would be so tired from doing all that work that we just flop down on the bed and pass out.
So it was a booming operation. It lent a lot to the economy of New Smyrna Beach. A lot of families depended on the Florida East Coast Railroad. Do you remember, was there any layoffs prior to a strike? We're going to talk about the strike.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. That was a big mistake.
That was. We're going to talk about that because it's part of the history of New Smyrna Beach. But that was the big strike was not until the late 1950s. I remember. Prior to that, did Florida East Coast Railroad during the 1930s or 40s? Did they have layoffs? Did people get laid off on their jobs?
No, there was so much work to do. They didn't. If they had a good employee, they didn't lay them off unless the employee wanted to be. No, I don't remember people being laid off.
So this was a very stable economic situation for many people.
Yes, it was
in New Smyrna Beach, and now it takes us up to the strike that changed everything with the Florida East Coast Railroad. The strike occurred, as I remember, in the late 1950s.
Right.
And as I remember it, the strike was over the issue at that time. The person who was in charge of the railroad in Florida, and you mentioned his name, Ed Ball, and I can tell you you're not a big admirer of Ed Ball, but he was the boss of Florida. His headquarters was in St. Augustine. And he made a decision in the late 1950s to end passenger service on the Florida East Coast Railroad and just have freight service because the passenger service was apparently not as economically advantageous as the freight service. And when he announced that, there were going to be layoffs, there were going to be some reductions in pay, and the people that worked for the railroad in New Smyrna Beach went on strike. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes, sir. I definitely do.
It was
it cut off my husband's job and my job. I didn't have a job, and it was hard because my mother was a widow and had no income at all. She was finally later the city of New Smyrna Beach asked her to be the director of the youth center, which was quite an honor because they knew her basic things in life were good, you know what I mean. She had a good attitude, she loved children, and they loved her, and I never will forget her funeral. And I remember it's plain as day to me when she had died and we were having her funeral. All of the children in that area came to her funeral in the youth center. And one by one, they would go up to where the casket was and kneel and say a prayer at Dudley Funeral Home. I'll never forget it. It's there. It'll be there forever.
Well, I remember the strike became very divisive.
Terrible. It separated families that never got back again.
Because most of the workers went on strike originally.
Right.
And I remember...
You know, for how much? 10 cents an hour.
That was what the strikers got from the union, from their union, 10 cents an hour?
That's what they wanted.
Oh, they wanted 10 cents an hour?
10 cents an hour more.
More.
10 cents.
And so Florida East Coast Railroad said no to that, and the workers went on strike.
Right.
And at that time, I think most of the workers did go on strike. You said your father went on strike?
No, my father wasn't a railroad. My father was deceased at that time.
Oh, okay. But you had...
Marcus was working for him, and he was laid off. And I didn't have a steady job. I had a job, but it was not a steady job, you know what I mean? If somebody wanted to go on vacation, we call him Mr. Mack, he would call and say, how about working for me a couple of weeks. Got to have a vacation. Okay, fine. I got work, because that's all we had. That's all we had. I had a twin sister, and the two of us supported our mother during all that.
So the strike was over 10 cents an hour raise.
I'll never forget it.
And all the people went out and carried signs saying we're on strike around the railroad terminal down Canal Street. And they had great hopes that they were going to be successful and break
Ed
Ball's.
But they did no such thing. He had more money than the God had.
So he won. Or the Florida East Coast Railroad did not give a 10-cent raise. They kept their operations going. And the strike lasted for
A long time.
a couple of years, didn't it?
It separated the town. I mean, you could have sliced right down the middle. The railroad people that were off, that chose to go off. They weren't made to go off. They chose to stop working. They thought it would bring him to his knees, but he had too much money. He was supported by billionaires, and he didn't have to worry about money.
After all these years, Lois Tipton is still passionate about a wide variety of topics related to local history. In our next episode, Miss Tipton will share more of her memories. Stay tuned as Frank and Lois discuss the local citrus industry and times of hardship during the Great Depression. Until then, for the New Smyrna Museum of History, I'm Greg Holbrook.